you hear me okay now?
I can.
Can you hear me, Governor?
Yeah.
What? One minute. Seconds.
You are looking live at Hanson Theater on the campus of Minnesota State University Moorhead. Tonight, home to the second Minnesota Governor's Debate. The candidates tonight are the incumbent Democratic Governor Mark Dayton, the challengers, Hennepin County Commissioner Republican Jeff Johnson, and from the Independence Party software developer Hannah Nicolette. I'm Dan Moss from WDAY Television. Our moderator tonight is Don Davis from Forum News Service. We'll be taking questions from our audience. You can also take part through social media. You can tweet your questions at #MinGov. That's #MNGOV. Best of luck. Your moderator, Don Davis.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you three for being here. Let's start with a general question about specifics. Some people have said this governor's race has included very few specific proposals, perhaps the fewest they've heard in campaigns in a long time. Prove that I'm wrong, right here and now. Give us three very specific and significant bills you would push as governor, or rules you would establish in the next 4 years. Again, make your answer specific, not just pass the budget. For this question, like most of them, you each have 60 seconds to respond, and then we'll go back through 30 seconds. And by drawing ahead of time, Governor Dayton, you start.
Last session, I proposed a child care tax credit for lower middle and middle income families to be better able to afford the rising cost of child care. Unfortunately, the legislature did not pass that bill. I will reintroduce it and push very hard for its passage. Secondly, transportation funding. I'll make a specific proposal including sales tax on gasoline that will raise close to the $6.5 billion that we're short for transportation funding over the next 10 years. And finally, I'll increase the child care. I'll continue to increase the funding for the special education for students who qualify.
Okay, Commissioner Johnson.
Thanks, Don, and thank you, all the hosts, for having us tonight. Number one, I will start auditing all of the programs. We will bring in an outside auditor and audit the programs that taxpayers fund. It'll probably take us 4 years to get through all of them. And we'll start with the human service programs because they're the easiest ones to measure, and the ones that can prove that they are doing what we claim to want them to do, we'll keep those programs, and the one that can't, we will end the ones that can't, we'll end those programs. Number two is the parent trigger. It's a bill that is passed in both New Jersey and California, and for schools that are chronically failing, it allows the parents of the kids in those schools to give a vote of confidence or no confidence in the school. And if a majority or maybe a supermajority say they no longer have confidence in the school, then something statutorily has to change. Maybe the school becomes a charter or the administration is removed. And then number three would be to require that at least basic permits in this state meet a minimum time requirement that matches the states that surround us.
Thank you. Ms. Nicolette.
So first, thank you for having me. And my first reform, I would want to eliminate the corporate income tax in Minnesota to help spur on private sector job growth. And second, I would like to change permitting and licensing so that the fees can never exceed the cost of processing the fees and help facilitate moving permitting and licensing along. And then as for my part, I would like to contribute to pardoning nonviolent drug offenders, at least to the extent that I'm able to do that with my vote.
Okay, each of you have 30 seconds to rebut the other if you want. You don't have to.
Well, Commissioner Johnson, you talk about your concern for education, yet when you were state legislator, you voted to cut funding for K-12 education, the fiscal 2005-06 biennium, at a lower by $76 million over the 2003-04. You voted twice against bonding projects that include here in Moorhead State University totaling $29.7 million. So your record doesn't support your concern for education, except that you go back to the same tired proposals that have been around for the last decade, vouchers and parental triggers.
Thank you, Governor. Commissioner.
Well, I must say this is frustrating because I brought this up at our last debate, Governor, that's not true, and you know it's not true, and the media has told you that it's not true. I voted to increase education funding every single biennium that I was in the legislature, a total of, I believe, over $4 billion. And I know it wasn't as much as some people may have wanted, but to say that we cut, and by the way, it's gone from $500 million to $600 million, now tonight to $76 million. It's simply untrue. You know it's untrue. I wish you'd stop saying it. I have a vested interest in public education as someone who went to it and someone who sent my kids to a public school.
Thank you. Ms. Nicolette, do you want to get into this?
Well, I see no need for rebuttal since,
Question 2. We'll start with you, Commissioner Johnson. A lot of our questions tonight revolve around Greater Minnesota because that's where we are. Greater Minnesota has different needs than the Twin Cities. I'd like each one of you to explain in the next 4 years, how would you treat the two parts of the state, Greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, differently, if at all?
I think this is a fundamental difference between Governor Dayton and me, and part of that is because I spent the first half of my life in Greater Minnesota. I was born and raised just down the street in Detroit Lakes. My wife is from Crookston. We went to Concordia in Moorhead. So the first half of my life is spent here, and I think that makes a difference. I think that the fact that my roots are here, that my family is here, actually gives me an appreciation of Greater Minnesota that maybe the current administration doesn't have. And we've seen, particularly in the past 2 years, Greater Minnesota has been largely an afterthought coming from the Dayton administration. Whether you look at what we've done with LGA funding, whether you look at the K-12 formula, whether you look at how we're spending transportation dollars on pretty much anything but rural roads and bridges, whether you look at some of the environmental regulations that are just killing our farmers and our manufacturing businesses in Greater Minnesota, you're going to see much more of a focus from me on Greater Minnesota than what we've seen in the past 4 years.
Ms. Nicolette.
well, when I see that we've spent the lion's share of the resources on the Twin Cities, it's obvious that there's a fairness problem between rural Minnesota and the metro area. When we've spent, we've got the Viking Stadium, light rail, that Senate office building, all of those massive expenditures tend to happen within the metro area. So I would like to see us focus. That's a good segue for transportation funding. We need to focus our resources on transportation funding. We also need to focus on rural schools. They aren't getting the funding that they need. Thank you.
Okay, Governor Dayton, 60 seconds.
Greater Minnesota is not a monolith, as you know. Doug, the northeastern part of Minnesota has different issues from northwestern and southwestern and so on. But the facts don't support that we have not given priority to Greater Minnesota as it's needed it. We have, in the last two bonding bills, 2013-14, 38% of the funding went to Greater Minnesota, 28% to the metropolitan area, and the rest were statewide, principally the state capital, which benefits everybody. We've spent in the last few years almost $100 million on flood mitigation right here in Moorhead and the surrounding area of the Red River. Commissioner Johnson, on the other hand, voted against disaster relief for Kittson County, voted against bonding for projects in this area. So for him to be accusing me of being not supportive of Greater Minnesota. It just simply isn't true. We've had economic development projects in Hawley and in Dilworth and here, right here in Moorhead. The unemployment rate here in Moorhead, Fargo Moorhead, is 2.8%.
Thank you. 30-second rebuttal, Commissioner?
Well, Don, I think the difference is really just a perspective and life experience. And as a guy who spent half his life, the first half of his life in Greater Minnesota versus somebody who never has lived outside of, I don't think, Minneapolis or New York, I picked a running mate who is a lifelong farmer in rural Olmsted County. The governor picked a running mate who's, I think, spent her whole life in Minneapolis as well, and I think that just gives you a different perspective. You don't really understand the differences and the special needs and struggles that Greater Minnesota has.
Ms. Nicolette?
Well, I think it's obvious. When you look at the funding, so Minneapolis spends $22,000 per child, and rural areas of Minnesota, the state average is about $10,000 per student, and rural Minnesota is often getting $5,000 to $6,000 per student. So when you look at the flat-out numbers, it's obvious that the funding, at least for education, is not even near equivalent. There's also the transportation funding, as I mentioned before, so that doesn't, when you build light rail, that doesn't help anybody in rural Minnesota.
Governor Dayton, in 30 seconds.
Commissioner Johnson, being from Greater Minnesota doesn't automatically mean you're for Greater Minnesota. Yes, I was born and raised in the Twin Cities area, and I've devoted the last 36 years of my career to working statewide. You devoted your career to working and serving in Hennepin County, which is fine, very important county, but you chose to live in Hennepin County, you chose to be a county commissioner, whereas I've been going statewide as United States Senator, as governor, all over the state. I'll match the number of miles I've spent traveling around Minnesota over the last 20 years with yours any day.
Thank you. Those are the first two questions. Let's hold your applause, audience. We want to get through a lot of questions. And now, to a special guest with Dana Mock.
Dr. Ann Blackhurst was just named president of MSUM. Dr. Blackhurst, the mic is yours.
Thank you.
Welcome to Minnesota State University Moorhead. My question is, what steps can the state of Minnesota take to keep our outstanding college graduates in our state, especially in outstate communities like Moorhead?
And the question goes first to Ms. Nicolette.
What we have in Minnesota is an opportunity problem. We have 49% of our employed individuals who are underemployed, so presumably making less than they expected and overqualified for the positions that they have. We also are ranked, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're ranked 41st in the nation, last in the Midwest in private sector job creation. Therefore, we need private sector job creation, which is why I said that I would like to eliminate the corporate income tax. And that's what I see in Ireland when they reduced their corporate income tax by 20% in the late 90s, and they saw an economic boom that got them nicknamed the Celtic Tiger. I would like to see something similar in Minnesota. I would like to see us increase opportunities for the students that are graduating so that they have good jobs, plenty of good jobs available to them once they get out of university.
Governor Dayton.
Well, jobs are obviously key to getting young people a place to stay in Minnesota, which most of them prefer. And as I said before, right now the unemployment rate in the Fargo-Moorhead area is 2.8%. Now that's obviously influenced by what's going on in North Dakota. But in Rochester it's 3.3%, St. Cloud is 3.6%. So we have economic growth occurring all over the state. I got to respond to these fictions about half the people in Minnesota are underemployed. The same study says 2/3 of the people graduated from higher education in Minnesota are underemployed. I mean, it's nonsense. It's just obvious, and no one bothered to verify it with reality because everybody ignored it. This number has been coming out for a decade, and everybody ignored it because it's just so obvious. All of it came from DEED, economic development, but it started under Governor Plenty, and I didn't even bother to pay attention to it because it's so clearly nonsense. We have a lower underemployment as measured by economists than most other states.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson.
Well, Governor, the number that you say is false and ridiculous comes from your administration. We get it every year from your administration, and the number's accurate. About half the people in the state are underemployed. They're overqualified for the jobs they're in, and I hear this everywhere I go as I'm traveling around the state of Minnesota. And to say it's no big deal, I think is out of touch. It's a big deal to all the college grads who are living in their parents' basement because they can't find a job to pay both their loans and rent at the same time, or to the middle-aged man or woman who's making maybe 60% of what they made 5 years ago when they were laid off because they can't find a career in this state anymore, or for the single mom who's working 2 jobs because she can't find one good one. Underemployment actually matters, and I think to answer the question, that is the key to keeping our kids, not kids, I guess, our graduates in the state of Minnesota. If we don't have careers for them, good paying full-time jobs, they're not going to stay.
And do we want to go with some rebuttals, Ms. Nicolette?
So last I heard, Minnesota was at 4.5% unemployment, which sounds like a good statistic in theory. Unfortunately, all jobs are not equal. Pharaoh in ancient Egypt had 100% employment. So clearly, every job does not produce wealth. And that is my concern for Minnesota, is that we need jobs that actually produce wealth, to produce, iPods, cars, whatever it is that they're making, but stuff and services that people want. And that's why eliminate the corporate income tax. Thanks.
Governor Dayton?
Well, the per capita income in Minnesota is $47,000, which is $6,000 a year higher than Wisconsin, and ranks 13th in the nation. Underemployment, Commissioner, by that study, which started under Governor Plenty, so I'm not going to alter what they do, but under that study, every police officer in Minnesota is quote-unquote underqualified. By that study, half of the nurses in Minnesota are underqualified. It doesn't make sense in the real world. I had a 5th grade math teacher who said, check your answer with reality, make sure it makes sense. This one just doesn't, and it ought to be ignored.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson?
Well, I couldn't disagree more. And I truly think that you are out of touch with what's going on in this state, because as I travel the state, I hear this over and over again. I hear people say, I am so tired of being told that everything is perfect, that we have the lowest unemployment rate in the country and everybody should be happy and all is rosy, because it's not for me. I hear that over and over and over again. And to say that it's irrelevant or silly or doesn't matter or we should ignore it, I don't think that's the right path forward for Minnesota. We can do better than what we're doing, a lot better.
I'm going to do a follow-up on that question with 30 seconds for each of you. Since we just heard a question about higher education from the Minnesota State University Moorhead president, let's turn to a couple quick questions, 30 seconds each for answers, from Minnesota State Colleges and University System students. First, the students want to know your opinions about reforming the state's higher education systems. Second, they ask if students should have a greater voice in higher education decisions. I think you can probably guess what they want you to say on that second part. Governor Dayton, 30 seconds to talk to the students here.
I appointed the 2 students, and I just made new appointments to the MNSCU board who are students at MNSCU campuses. I agree that they should have a strong voice, and goes on. They'll have a strong voice in the regional economic growth summits that I'll hold in December, where I'll come to places like Moorhead and I'll get the leading employers along with Minnesota State Moorhead and talk with them and students as well as what the employment opportunities are in that particular region and what the college and universities in that area can be doing to meet those needs.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson?
Well, of course they should have probably a stronger voice than they have right now. With respect to reform, I think there are several things we got to look at. We got to look at administrative expenses across the system. We heard of a pretty disturbing report with the U of M a few years ago. They've made some changes, but could probably go further. I think we should move more towards a centers of excellence model in the MNSCU system. I think we've got to look at why it's taking so long for students to graduate from the U of M. It's one of the worst rates in the Big Ten. And I think the money we spend should more follow students than go to administration.
Ms. Nicolette?
So first of all, I'd like to see some reform with the state universities in that they were originally created for poor students so that they would have an option, a no-frills option. So I'd like to see us go back to a no-frills option so that that's rather than competing with a private institution, you want the frills, then you go to a private institution. No frills, you can get a better, more economical education at a state university. Second, yes, students should have a say in reform. I think we'd have more innovation if they did.
Thank you. I have a second straight lightning round question, if you will. This will be 30-second answers. Go to Commissioner Johnson first. There's so many things the 3 of you could be doing. besides being a governor. Why do you want to be governor? It seems like it has a lot of problems, pains. And this time I don't want to hear about your specific policies. I want to hear about you and why you want to be governor. Commissioner Johnson.
This is going to sound really cheesy, Don, but I truly believe that a governor can change things for the better in this state. And I saw it when I was in the legislature. When I look at the federal government, I'm not sure what we can do to ever fix that. But I do believe that one person who's very focused, who's very passionate about a few important things, can actually make the place better for middle-class, everyday Minnesotans who I think are largely being forgotten right now.
Ms. Nicolette?
Mainly, well, I love my state. I'm a political junkie. I love to see what models work elsewhere, and I would like to implement them here. And when I've seen what I like in my favorite governors, it's that they have vision, integrity, and backbone, and the ability to say no. So, so I believe that we could implement really good policy with somebody who has backbone and the vision to make it happen. And I would like to do that for my state.
Governor Dayton, you've dealt with the Capitol Press Corps for 4 years. Why do you want to put up with this more?
Well, I would agree with almost every word that Commissioner Johnson gave in his answer. I devoted my career to public service, which is about trying to make this state, nation, and world better for especially the generations to come. My 2 sons, and I now have a grandson. That's a reason every day to get up and do what I can to make this a world a better place. I agree with him about Washington. I left the U.S. Senate after 6 years and became governor because I think there is a chance here in Minnesota to really make things happen for the better. And I think they have in the last 2.5 years.
Thank you. We're going to go with a full question now, so we each get 60 seconds, and then if you want to rebut, 30 seconds. This is what I call my get along question. Commissioner, you may have noticed that your opponents call you Tea Party Republican Jeff Johnson. Maybe noticed. Apparently that's an attempt to paint you as too conservative. Governor, you are widely regarded as pretty liberal, and your opponents say you are too far left to serve Minnesotans. And traditionally, the Independence Party says that it tries to take a middle ground, although that varies by subject. That looks to be the case again this year. The 2011 government shutdown was a prime example of extremes not being able to come to an agreement. The next 4 years, how would you reach out to the other sides of the political aisle to get things done? Or is that even important? Start with our Independence Party candidate.
I believe that the reason that you get involved in politics is because you want to make the world a better place. I mean, that's the reason that motivates people to show up at caucuses and sit in those long meetings. And I mean, it feels like you're on a 13-hour flight. You sit in tiny little chairs and you live on beef jerky. So the reason we all do it is because we love our country, we love our state. And so that's where I believe that I can work with anyone who has a vision to make the world a better place also. If we recognize that, our means may be different, but our goal is the same, then I think we can work together. And as far as the Independence Party goes, we represent a good chunk of Minnesotans in that we are socially live and let live, and we are fiscally responsible. We wouldn't spend money that we don't have, believe in cost-benefit analysis before doing an expenditure. So I would like to see Minnesotans represented better by a third option, and I think we are a good third option. We're also able to advance issues before they're popular.
Thank you. Democratic incumbent, Governor Dayton.
Well, in the 40 years that I've been involved mostly in public service here in Minnesota, I've been called all sorts of things and given all sorts of labels, so I really have stopped worrying about what people say. I worry about what can I do and what are the results that I've been able to achieve as governor for Minnesota. When you get 162,000 more jobs in Minnesota than when I took office, I call that whatever label you want, but that's real benefits for the people of Minnesota. When you talk about all-day kindergarten, which I sponsored in legislature and finally got passed in 2013, that means almost 50,000 children in Minnesota have a chance to improve their education at the very beginning. Early childhood scholarships, tuition freezes here at the University of Minnesota Moorhead and Minnesota State Moorhead and at the University of Minnesota campuses and all their MNSCU campuses for 2 years. Those are the results that I think matter to Minnesotans and should, I believe, be the basis for how they evaluate me and what label they want to attach.
Republican Johnson.
I think this is actually a good example of how the governor and I differ. I was in the House of Representatives as a Republican in the Republican House for 6 years while the DFL controlled the Senate. And every year I took one of the more difficult bills that we had as a Republican caucus and not only figured out how to get it through the Republican House, but went over to the DFL Senate and figured out what do we need to do to actually get it through the DFL Senate and then have it signed by a governor. And part of that is about focus, part of it's about relationships, and another part of it is about listening to the other side and figuring out what I've got to do to get something done. The last couple of years particularly, probably the last 4 years in St. Paul have been about as polarized as we've ever seen. We saw the longest shutdown in state history. With Governor Dayton as governor, and I know you blame it on the Republicans, Governor, but you were governor and you need to take some of the responsibility for that as well. And the last 2 years, I hear from Republicans all the time that we've been entirely ignored and they're moving forward with only one point of view.
Do you want a 30-second rebuttal, Ms. Nicolette?
I don't need a rebuttal.
Governor Dayton?
In 2011, I offered to meet the Republican majorities of the House and Senate halfway on the budget. We were $3 billion apart, and I conceded to $1.5 billion. I asked them to meet me by conceding $1.5 billion to raise taxes on the richest 2% of Minnesotans, rather than make further cuts in healthcare, human services, and education. They absolutely refused. So we had to go through that shutdown because the compromise is not a word that Tea Party activists believe should be part of the political vocabulary, and that's a big difference from when Commissioner Johnson was in the legislature, when I was in the U.S. Senate even.
Commissioner?
Well, Governor, when you were campaigning 4 years ago, you said you would never shut down government in order to get your tax increases, and you did. And is there blame to share? Of course there is. There's always blame to share, but sometimes you got to take some responsibility. When I'm governor, the buck will stop with me.
Thank you. We asked several weeks ago for people to email questions, and we got a huge variety of questions. If you want to go for 4 hours, we can ask email questions for 4 hours. But by far, the most emailed question, this will be, let's do this for 30 seconds so we can get to Dana. The most common question by far asked about your stand on the proposed Minnesota State High School League policy, which would allow transgender students to play on the gender team of their choice. Governor Dayton, 30 seconds.
You know, I think the high school league did the right thing by delaying it until they could give it further consideration. It's a very complicated issue, and giving transgender students a choice of which team they want to play on, I think, is problematic. So I think they were wise to take it back for further evaluation.
Commissioner.
Well, in the end, it's the decision of the Minnesota State High School League, and I appreciate that. I will tell you, as a dad of 2 teenage boys, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to have boys and girls in the same locker room.
Ms. Nicolette?
I would also put it in the hands of the Minnesota State High School League, and if there's a demonstrable harm, then we can address that as it comes. But I put it in their responsibility. They're the ones who deal with it on a hands-on basis.
Well, Dana, what's happening? What questions are you finding?
Questions from social media. And by the way, if you want to take part, it is #MinGov. That's #MNGOV. This is from @MartyHill_MN. How would you handle a public health emergency, such as if a case of Ebola was diagnosed in Minnesota? A man from Dallas just died today of Ebola after having been diagnosed after flying back from Liberia. Mr. Johnson, I believe you're up first.
Part of it is leadership, and part of it is preparation. And actually something that I've been talking about the last few days because of the fear about Ebola, and I think some of that fear is real, and probably some of it is a bit sensationalized, but we ought to have an Ebola task force in this state of some of the smartest healthcare professionals and other government officials that we have in this state to prepare us for the event that actually happens. So I think it's more about preparation than about anything else.
Ms. Nicolette?
I also think that the fears are sensationalized, but we've had quarantines in the past and we know how to handle those situations. Ebola isn't necessarily anything new. We just take what is specific to Ebola and apply it with regard to, usually the National Guard is somehow involved, but quarantining is part of it. And we've done it before, we can do it again.
Governor Dayton, I think I saw a press release about this from you today.
We have a hugely important responsibility, which we've had a task force now since the beginning of my term, led by Adjutant General of the Minnesota National Guard, Richard Nash. Those agencies that are responsible for responding to emergency situations. Tomorrow we're having a meeting of those members of the cabinet, the agencies that do share that responsibility, and some others that we're including. And that will lead into a meeting next week with a wider group of people, health experts in the private sector and public sector, county officials from Hennepin County and elsewhere. The Minneapolis Airports Commission is going to have to possibly deal with somebody landing on a plane. So yes, this is very, very vitally important, and they've been meeting on this already, preparing for it. There are hazmat teams all over the state prepared for response, but we can't be too vigilant when something like this could possibly land on our doorstep.
Rebuttal, Commissioner?
No, I don't think so.
Anybody? Going once, going twice? Dana?
Second question, this comes from our studio audience. Are you in favor of an oil pipeline running through Minnesota? Ms. Nicolette.
Yes, I am. Right now it's the most environmentally sensible option. When we have, in the 1970s, the Alaska pipeline there were all kinds of scares about that building the Alaska pipeline would ruin the mating patterns of caribou, and instead the caribou herds increased 450%, and they started walking on the pipeline. They actually like it in the winter because it's warm, and so it turned out that they worked alongside the pipeline. What's great about the pipeline is we would get oil off the rail right now, which we have a crisis in moving grain and oil along the rails because of all the North Dakota oil. So I would like to put it in, that pipeline, the Sandpiper pipeline, would replace 1,951 rail cars. So that would be by far the best solution environmentally, because of course then you're looking at reduced emissions, and then also 500 trucks off the highways. So best environmental option, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
Governor Dayton?
We need a pipeline, probably the Sandpiper pipeline, to transport this additional amount of oil from North Dakota. The oil production from North Dakota is more than doubled in just 2 years. So Ms. Nicholas is correct about the capacity problem we have on our rail system. There also needs to follow the statute that was set by the legislature and previous governors, which does everything possible to protect Minnesotans from the environmental catastrophe if an oil pipeline should leak. The pipeline route proposed by Enbridge goes through some of the most ecologically sensitive and inaccessible areas of northwestern and northern Minnesota. So people want to say, well, speed it up and ram it through so we can satisfy people who want to transport oil through Minnesota and make money on the East Coast is not something that I would agree to. The Public Utilities Commission is given by the Minnesota legislature the responsibility to make this evaluation, make its decision. Those are 5 full-time members. We should give them the chance.
Commissioner Johnson?
Well, Governor, you can't say you want it to happen because your administration is trying to kill it. We saw it just a couple weeks ago from your 3 appointees to the PUC. I'm absolutely in support of it. We do have a process to get through, but it seems like we are slow walking that process in order to kill the thing. I was in Eldred yesterday or the day before, which is just south of Crookston, and I was speaking with some farmers in the grain elevator there. Danny Grunewald is running the grain elevators. He said the farmers are getting killed because they can't get their crops on the trains because the trains are full of oil and they're running straight across northern Minnesota. We have a potential solution here. The Sandpiper would not only create approximately 1,500 private sector jobs, but more importantly, it solves the problem that the farmers are having. And I don't think we can always hide behind the process and say, well, it's someone else's fault and we're just going to push it out to decide a year or 2 or 3 years down the road. Eventually, we got to take some action, stand where we stand, and get things done.
30-second rebuttal.
Yeah, well, if you know, right now the studies are being done end on end, and they should be done simultaneously because we're 90% there as far as approval for the Sandpiper, and it would happen a lot faster if there weren't these if there weren't the demand for delays.
Rebuttal, Governor?
Well, Commissioner Johnson just clearly doesn't understand the process and in the statute. I appoint the members of the Public Utilities Commission, and then they're independent. They have 6-year terms so they can operate according to their own best judgment. I appoint judges, but I can't call a judge and tell him or her how to rule on a particular case. I can't call a member of the Public Utilities Commission and tell them what they should or shouldn't do. And that's to protect the people of Minnesota from any one person trying to run roughshod over the protections that other people need. And you know, if you're going to take on that responsibility, Governor, I think you're making a big mistake.
Thank you. Commissioner, 30 seconds.
I do understand the process, Governor. And what we have is a PUC, Public Utilities Commission, of 5 members. And they voted 3-2 to delay this project in a way that the PUC has never done before. They are blazing new ground because they don't want this to happen. They want to kill it. The 3 appointees that voted to essentially kill this project were your 3 appointees. The other 2 were appointees of a different governor. And once again, I think as governor, we need to sometimes take responsibility for what's happening in our own administration.
I want to jump in with a follow-up here, and we'll make this a full question. Start with Governor Dayton, because this is related to what you were talking about. When I was driving through Moorhead today, I didn't see any oil trains, but I saw 2 other big unit trains. So it's not just the oil here. What I want to know is, be specific about what you would do to help rail congestion, to ease rail congestion and rail safety in the next 4 years. Governor Dayton.
Well, again, what's triggered this has been the North Dakota oil production has doubled in the last 2 years. And most of that is going on our rail system, and obviously you don't build rail tracks overnight. And we don't control how the railroads operate their businesses and where they choose to direct their traffic. So we have an overload, absolutely, of oil tankers, grain, propane shipments, coal to Duluth and other places that need for electrical power generation.
So what would you do?
And the system is overloaded. Well, within the limits of what we can do, I've met with Burlington Northern's CEO twice, been on the phone. I've set up a conference call with Minnesota Power for early next week to talk about their problems getting coal. We're going to have to manage this situation on a case-by-case basis. We're not going to have more rail tracks immediately. We asked Burlington Northern to give us their data on their capital investments for the next couple of years, but it's simply going to take some time.
Commissioner Johnson, what would you do in the next 4 years?
Well, I think a part of it is actually sitting down with the railroads, not shooting off a tough-sounding letter to score some political points, but actually sitting down with them and saying, how can we solve this problem? We need a governor who is a problem solver, who is engaged, and who actually works with people that maybe have differing opinions. And you can do that in this case. Now, do we have control over them? Would I, as a governor? Of course not. I don't. They're regulated by the federal government. But it's not just about sending tough-sounding letters. You got to sit down with them and try to convince them that this could be a positive for everyone. But I got to go back to the pipelines again, because that is by far the best solution to this problem. Yes, it's not just the oil, but it is largely the oil that has caused the problem the last 2 to 3 years. And if we could get a lot of the oil off the rails, that would largely solve our problem.
Ms. Nicolette?
I talked to Tim Giesecke, is my running mate. He's a part-time farmer and he runs an ag and environmental consulting business, and I talked to him about this issue because it is at a crisis level. They're not even giving delivery estimates for grain and oil anymore on the rail. So it's clearly something that has to be addressed. And if we could get the oil off the rails, then his farmers are looking at a $100 million loss this year because of crops going bad sitting on the rails. And if we could get the oil off the rails, then at least we could get the grain moving. And that's, oil obviously isn't going to go bad sitting on the rails, but the Sandpiper pipeline would be, that's the equivalent of 1,951 rail cars. So that would clearly help us get that moving along.
Do you want a rebuttal?
That's a lot of rail cars, and the pipeline, as I said before, is definitely needed but it's going to reduce the increase in the amount of oil transported through Minnesota in the years ahead. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's an important part of solving the problem. But we got a situation in our hands where the rail companies are, by federal law, able to decide what they're going to transport and what they're not, what priority they're going to give, and the only way to work with them is to work with them. I've met twice now with Burlington Northern. They've got another meeting scheduled for next week, and to continue to work with them to get this situation handled until we can have more capacity.
30 seconds, Commissioner.
Well, Don, I'll just reiterate that it's tough to hear, Governor, you say, we got to get that pipeline done when your appointees are essentially trying to kill it. And I think that comes down to taking responsibility as governor and appointing people who actually understand the needs of greater Minnesota rather than just the metro or a certain special interest, such as the environmental special interest.
Ms. Nicolette, do you want the last word on this?
I don't need a rebuttal.
Well, let's go to Dana and see what the real people are asking.
From our studio audience, I come from a rural community. My father is a farmer. I want to be a farmer. The funding for rural education made my school go to a 4-day week instead of 5. What would you do for schools that are getting left in the dust? How can I have the same opportunities?
Commissioner Johnson, 60 seconds.
This is a huge problem, and I think it goes to the bigger issue, particularly in the last few years, of greater Minnesota largely being an afterthought to this administration. We see it in K-12 funding. The average per pupil funding in Minnesota, I believe, is about $10,700. A lot of schools around here are probably below that average. The Minneapolis schools spend upwards of $21,000. That's almost twice as much. And the results are not good at all. In fact, they're terrible. And, you know, I believe money is part of education, but it's not the only part of education. We have to start demanding results. And my goal would be I've got a bias when it comes to K-12 education funding, to move as much as possible to that per pupil formula, so that a student is a student. You have to understand there are different needs in different parts of the state. So it's never going to be straight up a student is a student, but we have gotten so far from that in the last few years that it's really hurting a lot of families and kids in greater Minnesota.
Ms. Nicolette.
Well, Minnesota right now, we spend 43% of our budget on education, so it's a good chunk of the budget, but it could be reallocated, and that's where, you know, we are spending an awful lot in the Minneapolis public schools, and we're getting a 50%, less than 50% graduation rate, which is dismal. So we need to innovate. It's time to just recognize that, you know, when kids come out of school, 40% of them require remedial education once they get into college. That's one issue. There's also, you know, for rural schools, we're going to need to recognize that there are some standards that are not helping with regard to teaching. We have, you know, if you're a math teacher in Ohio, you can't come to Minnesota and become a teacher. You have to go through licensing requirements here. So I think there are some, and 90% of Minnesota principals surveyed said that they were having trouble finding good teachers to fill the roles. So if we're having trouble finding teachers, then we need to loosen some of those restrictions that aren't necessarily student-focused.
Governor, 1 minute.
We've increased state support for public education in Minnesota K-12 by almost $1 billion, and most of that has gone into the increase in the per pupil formula. And I agree with Commissioner Johnson that that should be the priority, because that gives each school district the funding by which they can decide how best to allocate it. We're funding all-day kindergarten. It's right here in Moorhead and across the state is opening the doors for 5-year-olds everywhere who were denied previously the chance, or whose parents were required to be able to afford to pay for kindergarten, the chance to get a fair start. The funding for K-12 education went down during the time that Commissioner Johnson was voting against for funding cuts, and also voting to increase the school shifts, the borrowing from the school districts, by almost $1 billion. And that's the burden that I inherited when I came to office. We paid off the school shift. We don't owe the schools anything. They have that money with which to operate, and we've increased per pupil funding, and if I'm governor, we'll do more.
I'm betting we want some rebuttals. Commissioner?
Well, Governor, you used the school shift twice to balance your own budget. So to claim that it's, again, the Republicans' fault, I think is not taking responsibility. But the bigger issue of our funding formula, the problem with our funding formula is, number one, no one understands it, K-12 funding formula, because it's so complex, and it has been built over the years based on politics. How you get the votes to pass the bills is you keep sending certain funding streams here, there, and everywhere. It should be simplified. We should put as much as possible on the per pupil formula and give school districts more authority to spend it the way they see fit.
Ms. Nicolette, 30 seconds.
Well, clearly, one size fits all doesn't work for education, and so, you know, for instance, my daughter goes to French immersion. Why did she go to French immersion? Because she started reading at 3, and by 5 she was reading at a 7th grade level. Good for her. So going to kindergarten and learning to read wouldn't have made sense, and that's why we need to specialize in education. So with regard to that, I'd like to see a home rule charter for counties so that they're able to give solutions that work with their students and innovate, offer more distance ed options, and accept or make use of the technology that's available.
Governor Dayton, 30 seconds.
Well, in 2011, I offered, as I said earlier, to meet the Republican leadership in the legislature halfway. We were $3 billion apart. I agreed to another $1.5 billion in spending reductions. I wanted to raise taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans, not on middle-income Minnesotans. In fact, to lower their property taxes. And I made that proposal, and the legislature absolutely refused. We went into a shutdown mode, and finally, given their continued intransigence and the likelihood of an even longer shutdown, I agreed to something I didn't agree with, a proposal they made before, and we borrowed $750 million from the schools additionally, and now we paid it all back.
Thank you. I have a question and a follow-up, and then we'll go back to Dana. In this part of the state, a major issue is a flood control project in the Moorhead-Fargo metropolitan area. One of the controversies, of course, is how the water to be stored. Farmers to the south don't want it on their land or don't like aspects of that. Another part of the dispute is Minnesota says some dikes are going up around communities before the state can do proper environmental studies. Third dispute is what some see as underrepresentation for Minnesota on the governing body. Given all that, what would you do as governor about a Moorhead-Fargo flood project in the next 4 years? Ms. Nicolette, 60 seconds.
I actually talked to former Governor Ed Schaefer about this today, Governor of North Dakota, and we talked about the 2 plans that have been offered and how the original plan didn't actually require storing land and taking out farmland after the fact. So what he expects from the total cost is about $1.8 billion, and he expects $800 million to come. Well, actually, he thought about $600 million would come from the federal government, and then Minnesota would chip in $100 million, and North Dakota would chip in $900 million. So there's your billion. But if that's the case, then, and actually he said that the cost could be cut down by 1/3 if the federal government wasn't involved. So 1/3 is about what they're willing to chip in. It sounds like the federal government shouldn't be involved. We can cut the costs, but it is a necessary project. I mean, flooding constantly in Fargo and Moorhead is obviously very undesirable, and we want to avoid it. So we need to pick a solution, but probably not with federal help.
Thank you. Governor?
I'm very willing to work with the state of North Dakota, with the city of Fargo, to develop a permanent resolution to the flooding problems that afflict both Moorhead and Fargo and the region around them. But I'm not going to let North Dakota just run the project and run roughshod over the situation that it'll create for Minnesotans and actually North Dakota farmers as well that are south of Moorhead and Fargo, so that they can have additional land for development in South Fargo. And I intervened, I stopped that process, slowed it down anyway. I insisted that there needs to be more representation by Minnesotans on that authority. There are 7 of the 9 members now in North Dakota. I've insisted that they follow the Minnesota state law and wait for our environmental impact statement to be completed next spring before they proceed on a project that requires Minnesota's consent and agreement to go ahead. And my actions so far, and I'll continue to follow through, have been instrumental in bringing this, slowing it down.
Commissioner. Hold the applause, folks.
Well done First of all, I'm always an optimist in believing that when good people who have differences can sit down and spend some time, if something is important, they can get it done. This needs to get done, but I will be a very strong advocate as governor for property owners in Minnesota, and in some cases I think they've been overlooked in this process. Here, however, is where you're going to see, again, a kind of a difference in style between the governor and me, because we've known about this issue for years, and the governor had not been engaged in it until a few months before the election, when he came up here and held some town hall meetings and threw some bricks over it at North Dakota, and then decried why we can't work better together. That's not how you get it done. I would have been involved in this years ago. I would have been meeting with the governor of North Dakota years ago to start talking about how can we get this done, because both Fargo and Moorhead need it, but how can we get it done in a way that doesn't hurt property owners in Minnesota? I think it's possible. I don't know the answer, but I think it's possible if you work hard enough at it.
30-second rebuttal?
Well, I don't see that, I mean, Fargo and Moorhead both have, they both have something to benefit in not being flooded, and I don't really see North Dakota as our opposition. They're our neighbors. We would want to work with them to form a solution, because this is like the Twin Cities is, you know, it'd be like opposing St. Paul and Minneapolis, and so obviously we can work together to find a solution, and without the federal government we would be able to do it as states working hand in hand. 30 seconds, Governor.
Well, I've been involved in this for years, and what was started out as a cooperative process veered off of that when first a new proposal came out from the Army Corps, which causes harm to Minnesota farmers at the expense, their expense, so that land in South Fargo can be used for commercial development. We put almost $100 million into flood mitigation here on the Minnesota side of the river. Most of that, since I became governor, we've given a lot of attention. We'll continue to give it more attention.
Commissioner?
I'll just reiterate, I think it's a difference in styles. I will be engaged, very engaged as governor in most things that come along, and I'll be engaged early rather than late when things spin out of control.
Now, my follow-up that I promised, being a greater Minnesota reporter, I'm always covering floods, it seems like, somewhere in the state. And I'd like to know, we'll start with Governor Dayton. What can you do as governor to mitigate the flood situation, prevent floods, help people recover faster from floods?
Well, you're right, Don. The changes in topography caused by modern farming and by development and other changes have put pressure on our water systems in ways that cause things that didn't happen before. And it's not one size fits all. You know, down in Owatonna, 4 years ago, the houses flooded and they put in 2 holding ponds. And as a result, this last flooding, no homes were damaged. As I said, in Moorhead, we put it in 100 million. Breckenridge, which was flooded years ago, has not been flooded recently. Granite Falls has been spared. Montevideo has been spared. So the mitigation that we have applied over the last number of years has made a huge difference, and it's made the difference between serious flooding and protection. Here in Moorhead, I was up here sandbagging in 2009, again in 2010. So far, Moorhead has been able to avoid that kind of catastrophe because of the efforts that the city has made, the county, and the state.
Commissioner?
I think largely flooding has been probably more of a nonpartisan issue than most issues in St. Paul, and I think that's a good thing. And as somebody who has also sandbagged as a student at Concordia in Moorhead 2 or 3 of the years that I was here, I recognize how devastating that can be, and obviously we're doing a little better here in Moorhead than some places are right now. I think that the fund that was created for flood relief makes sense, so that you don't always have to call a special session. I believe that was done in a bipartisan manner, and I think you'll see, regardless of the governor, hopefully a bipartisan approach to this issue.
Ms. Nicolette?
Well, obviously the governor isn't God and can't control the weather, but to the extent that flooding is predictable and happens repeatedly, then yeah, we need good infrastructure as a state, and you task engineers with good bids, reliable contractors, and implement good solutions. And that's what we'd like to see with the Fargo-Moorhead diversion and in any other areas like it.
Anybody want to rebut, especially her comment that the governor's not God?
Controversial statement. There you go.
Let's go to Dana.
From our studio audience, and a concern with the financing of the Vikings Stadium, is it time to admit Minnesotans got fleeced by Ziggy Wilf and the Vikings?
Goes to Commissioner Johnson.
Yes.
Thank you. Should we move on?
I'll keep going. I think the biggest problem with the Viking Stadium was how it was done. I think what we ended up with was about $500 million of taxpayer funds. And the promise was made early on that we're never going to use general fund money for the People's Stadium. We ended up using general fund money for the People's Stadium because we so embarrassingly miscalculated what e-pull tabs would bring in. I think they came in, Governor, at around 5%, or maybe it was 7% or 3%. But we had to go back then and essentially use a new tax that would have otherwise gone into the general fund to fund the stadium. The whole thing's been a debacle, from Governor, you not knowing that there were seat licenses in there and expressing outrage at that, even though it was in the bill that you signed, to the fact that we didn't seem to know that the Wilfs had legal problems when we signed that bill, to, of course, the funding has just, it's been a disaster from the start.
Ms. Nicolette, stadium.
When I see us paying for a stadium, I think we must have all of our needs taken care of, right, as a state? And yet, half of our roads are over 50 years old and need of repair, and the sewer systems underneath also need repair, and we also have 1,000 bridges that are structurally deficient. So we have some needs as a state, and instead, I don't understand how we feel that we have the money to, I mean, $640 million is a lot of money to throw at a Vikings stadium, and the way that it was done, I agree with Jeff Johnson that the way that it was done is concerning to me. That when when the Twin Stadium attempted to get a referendum passed, and even though they outspent in their lobbying efforts, they outspent their opponents 10-1. They knew that this was not a winning issue. 68% of Minnesotans wanted the Viking Stadium entirely privately funded. So the way that they did it this time is they had a backroom deal. They had 4 people in a room so that they never had to allow the press in those meetings, and when the press came knocking, they said they were talking about fishing regulations.
Thank you. Governor, do you have anything to say about this?
Well, tell the 7,500 people who are going to work in this project and are now, 38% of them whom are men and women of color, that this project is a debacle. It's easy to sit on the sidelines having had nothing to do with it and take pot shots. But the fact is, we didn't dictate this agreement. The Vikings held the upper hand. The lease that expired at the Metrodome, they were said, and we were told by the commissioner of the NFL they were going to move somewhere else. So they had to agree to the deal, which I negotiated along with to the lead Republicans who were in the majority at the time. Senator Rosen, Representative Maury Lanning from the Moorhead area did a phenomenal job of holding their feet to the fire, asking the last night for another $50 million, which they agreed to provide. As a result of that investment, there's over $1 billion of private investment going into projects that are around the stadium that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. If we hadn't done the stadium deal, Vikings would be going, the Metrodome would be dilapidated and without anybody paying to rent it, and no economic development occurring in that part of Minneapolis.
You want to rebut?
Sure.
Go right ahead.
Well, I have trouble hearing that we really had no control over this. The Vikings got to make the decisions. I think that's a bad position for a governor to be in, and I don't think it's necessary. I think we need a governor. I think Minnesotans deserve a governor who owns his decisions and is engaged, knows what's in the bill as he signs, which did not happen here, Governor. You said you negotiated it, but you didn't know what was in the bill on 2 or 3 different occasions. And I will stand by my statement that this is a debacle.
Next.
When my 7-year-old would throw tantrums and ask for candy, I stuck it out. I let her scream. I let her throw herself on the floor. It was sometimes really embarrassing because she loved sugar, ice cream, cookies. She didn't want to eat any real food. But sometimes it's time to call their bluff, and that's what a governor with backbone would do. Because if the Vikings say that they're going to move, fine, move. We'll accept that. And you know, maybe someday a team that has more respect for Minnesotans will move back to the Twin Cities.
I bet your daughter will thank you for that story. Governor?
If you think it's fine for the Vikings to move, then, you know, that's a different view from what I have and a lot of Minnesotans. I didn't say that we didn't have control. I didn't have control. I just said that the Vikings had their say in this as well, that they lease had expired at the Metrodome. They were free to move. They said they were going to move. The commissioner of the National Football League told us that if we didn't reach an agreement in this session, they would move. So we made an agreement. We made an agreement that's resulted in 7,500 jobs, over $1 billion of private investment in the area surrounding the stadium, and economic growth that wouldn't have occurred otherwise.
From our studio audience, if raising the gas tax to increase transportation funding is not an attractive option, how else would you increase funding to meet the current and future needs of the state?
Ms. Nicolette?
Well, we're looking at $7 to $9 billion. That's according to MnDOT. And actually, I spoke to a guy who works for MnDOT, and he said that for political reasons, they've tried to make it seem less dire than it really is, so the cost could be higher. However, you know, we could be looking at, you know, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa managed to do their roads. They, you know, they have similar setbacks that we do, the freezing cold weather, for instance, and they managed to fix their roads for about half the cost that we do. So perhaps we should look into what they're doing and cut our costs in half. But bonding for roads needs to be an option, and I would look at all non-essential spending, get rid of all non-essential spending, because right now we need to focus that to whatever extent we can of bonding on roads and bridges. And then at the end of the day, if we still don't have enough, then possibly a gas tax increase. But I would hesitate to implement a gas tax increase unless all of our other options were exhausted and we were no longer prioritizing little trains.
Governor, you mentioned gasoline sales tax earlier.
The experts tell us there's a $6 billion shortfall, what we expect from existing state and federal revenues, and what it's going to cost just to maintain our roads, highways, and bridges in the condition they are today, which is significantly worse in many areas from what they were 25 years ago when we stopped making the necessary investments in our highways, roads, and bridges. People who say we're going to find efficiencies sufficient to deal with that or reorder priorities, I just don't think they're being candid with the people of Minnesota about how you're going to fill a $6 billion shortfall. We need more revenues. We're going to have to come up with more revenues. If I'm governor next session, transportation will be a major issue at the legislature. We'll talk about what we're willing to commit as people in Minnesota to improve our transportation network, because what it will cost, and then we'll turn all the cards face up on the table. If we can save money, great. If we can reorder priorities, great. But we're going to need to come up with additional revenues, or we're going to have to accept the fact that our transportation system will continue to deteriorate.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Well, Don, I do believe that we should start bonding for roads. I think there's no better definition of what should be in a bonding bill, which is supposed to be statewide or regional projects that are long-term, than roads and bridges. And here is the problem. It is priorities. It's about priorities. We had the biggest tax increase in state history, and we're saying we don't have enough money to fill potholes. That's nuts. We are all of focus, all of the energy on transportation these last couple of years has been on everything but roads and bridges. It's been on light rail trains and commuter rail trains and high-speed rail and trolleys and streetcars and bike paths and sidewalks and what are called complete streets, which is everything but the street, I've come to learn. We need to prioritize what everybody relies upon, which are the roads and bridges. I just learned yesterday we could repair every single of the 1,200 deficient bridges, structurally deficient bridges in this state for what it's costing to build the Southwest Light Rail. We need to set our priorities, and to suggest that we got to raise taxes again is wrong.
Do you want a second shot at transportation? Go ahead.
So, you know, if we manage to find the money for the Vikings, the Senate office building, light rail, that's several billion right there, then we can certainly find the money to fix the roads and bridges. And definitely, good roads are expensive, but bad roads are even more expensive. And we get a $3 to $4 return for every dollar that we spend in a cost benefit on roads and bridges. So I would focus, try to do it any way we can, but at the end of the day, I am not standing here and ruling out a gas tax increase because I don't like to break promises.
Want to move a little more in transportation?
Well, I think Ms. Dickel made a good point. Repairing them is expensive, not repairing them is more expensive and becomes more costly to finally do so years down the road. So that's why we're inherited 25 years of avoidance of increased investments that Minnesota needed in its roads, highways, and bridges, and public transit. And now we're going to have to work to catch up. There's revenue that can be raised. It's going to have to come from somewhere. It's going to have to come from Minnesotans because the federal government's not going to be doing much more. So, we have the way, we just need to determine if we have the will or if people want to allow the system to continue to deteriorate.
Commissioner?
Governor, it can't always be someone else's fault. You've had all DFL control of the legislature for 2 years. And I look at the Senate office building. There was more money dedicated to that than what you put into roads and bridges in the $1.1 billion bonding bill. We could actually be moving on this, but we're not because the focus is somewhere else. And I have trouble believing that anything is going to change, Governor, if you're elected again. We're still going to see that focus on everything but roads and bridges.
Thank you.
This question from an entrepreneur in our audience. I have seen many ambitious friends leave Minnesota for areas such as Silicon Valley. My question is, what can you do as governor to help bolster innovation and startups to keep our brightest from leaving our great state?
You have a minute, Governor.
Anecdotally, people will leave, go to California, they go to other places for other opportunities. But in the aggregate, Minnesota find those opportunities. We have one of the growing high-tech industries concentrated in the metropolitan area, but located elsewhere. We have agricultural technology in southern and southwestern Minnesota, Worthington, Laverne, places like that that have major projects underway that are shipping products all over the world. So, and we have a great opportunity with what Mayo Clinic is doing, which Commissioner Johnson said he would have voted against. But the fact of that, and what it's going to do over the next 20 years to bring medical technology, more of it into Minnesota. And if we improve the quality of the University of Minnesota medical system, as I'm going to propose for the next session, Minnesota will be even more of a magnet for medical technology jobs. And that's one of the fastest growing areas of our economy, and a good one.
Commissioner?
Well, Don, this is a huge difference between the governor and me. I think this will be job number one for me, because we are not creating the good jobs that are keeping people here. They're moving elsewhere. We're losing a generation of entrepreneurs to North and South Dakota, for heaven's sakes. That's crazy. This is a better place to live, but we've become so unfriendly in the last couple of years to anyone who wants to either start a business or expand a business that they are choosing to go elsewhere. The Kauffman Foundation, which is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan group that measures business startups, ranks Minnesota over the last 4 years last in the country per capita for creation of new businesses. We've lost 4 Fortune 500 headquarters since the governor was elected. We've gone from 21 to 17. There is no reason to suggest that that's not going to continue. And this is kind of personal for me. I want my kids, after they go to college here or somewhere else, I want them to choose to either stay here or come back here. But if we're not creating the jobs, which we're not doing right now, there's not going to be a reason for them to do that.
Ms. Nicolette?
Minnesota is not setting ourselves up well for the future when it comes to job creation. Medtronic should have been a wake-up call to us. They told us why they left. They said that they renounced their U.S. legal tax status because Ireland has a 12.5% corporate income tax rate, and so they're able to save $1 billion a year. And I don't blame them for doing that because the medical device industry is competitive, and that's just the best thing for their business for them to have done. But we need to, and I'll flesh this out a little bit, we eliminate the corporate income tax, we put a sale on doing business in Minnesota, and historically speaking, that means that we receive an economic boom. And we broadcast it across the country that Minnesota is now open for business and will be business friendly, and we will see an increase in jobs as a state.
We have a lot of questions, very little time. Do you three want to rebut?
Yes, I do.
Go right ahead.
My opponents remind me of the old saw, you know, my mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts. I mean, the facts are Minnesota's economy is improving faster than most other states. Forbes magazine, a business-oriented magazine, ranks Minnesota 8th for best business climate, 2nd for a place to live and raise a family. You know, the career opportunities are there. We need to create more of them, absolutely. But, you know, all I hear from Commissioner Johnson is denigrate Minnesota, denigrate Minnesota, denigrate Minnesota. Very little about what you're going to do to make things better.
I bet you want to say something, Commissioner.
Yes, I would. Thank you. And I don't denigrate Minnesota. I do denigrate the direction that you have us headed, Governor. And if you want to talk about facts, look at the most recent fact we've seen. The Bureau of Labor Statistics 2 weeks ago gave us the last year. And we are 41st in the country in our job growth rate and worst in the Midwest. Every state that surrounds us is doing better than we are. Yes, we grew jobs during the first 2.5 years of your term. Maybe that was part of the Republican budget that you hated so much. But once yours was brought up, we've hit a brick wall. We've got to change directions.
Ms. Nicolette?
There is no doubt that Minnesota has a fantastic quality of life. I love our artsy, foodie culture. That, you know, we have beautiful natural resources, gorgeous river towns. Minnesota has a fabulous quality of life, which is no wonder that so many businesses would want to come here. But clearly they're not coming here. And so what I see holding them back is that we have been taking our businesses for granted. So when I look at what we've got, corporate income tax is only 4% of total revenue. It's a small percent of revenue. It eats up a lot of time in compliance. It's the most costly to collect.
Thank
Eliminate
you.
it.
We have so many questions, and I'll try to get back to you folks after the debate sometime in the next couple of weeks asking some of these. But one thing we have to talk about, you've touched on it now and then, we have to talk more about taxes, everybody's favorite subject. Give us an idea of how the tax structure in the state would look in the next 4 years if you were governor. And I know a couple of you have heard me ask this, but especially on ag-related taxes, since this is a greater Minnesota debate. Talk about the ag property tax and the small business tax, which taxes that affect people around here. That's a lot to talk about. We've got to hit that topic. Commissioner, you're up.
Once again, I think there's a big divide between the governor and me on this issue. I believe that taxes in the state should be low, broad, and simple. And the key word of those three is low. They're too high in this state. And you can look at almost any of the taxes and they're probably too high. But I would start by looking at the corporate tax and the income tax, but also following up to see if there's anything we need to change on the sales tax or the property tax, including the ag property tax. And, you know, we were told during the last session that part of the reason that taxes were going to go up so high at the state level was that property taxes were going to drop. I think your promise was $121 or $141 million drop in property tax. That didn't happen. Property taxes continued to increase. Just taxing more at the state level is not going to solve our property tax problem. It's much deeper than that.
Ms. Nicolette, taxes.
So obviously, you know, sometimes we make the mistake. You know, you always get the question, what are you gonna cut if you're going to, you know, if you say that you're gonna cut taxes, you have to cut spending in proportion. That's the wrong question. The revenue is not a fixed pie. It changes from month to month, year to year. It can change it from everything from the weather to anything else. So with regard to property taxes, any other taxes, what I would like to do is implement strategies, strategic decreases in taxes so that we would see an increase in revenue as a state and then respond with other drops in taxes, because ideally we would like to drop. Right now we have a situation with property taxes and farmers where, you know, they're paying a disproportionate share because of property values. They're not selling their property, they're not actually receiving that value, but, you know, at $30 to $40 an acre now, their property taxes are steep, and so they're picking up the lion's share. So maybe, you know, we look at some fairness with regard to that, where you know, maybe their house and their property is looked at as the comparison with other residential properties, and the rest of their land is looked at as a tool.
Governor Dayton.
Well, Commissioner Johnson, low, broad, and simple is not a tax policy. It's a slogan. And lowering taxes, as you recited, for everybody, for everything, is not a tax policy, and it's not reasonable unless you're willing to say where you're going to cut $1.5 or $2 billion out of the budget. I went through this with the Republican legislature in 2011. They campaigned saying we're going to cut taxes, and they didn't want to cut the spending to the level necessary to accomplish that. So they raided money from the schools and from the cutbacks of local government aid and tobacco bonding. My proposed policy has been straightforward. It's to turn budget deficits to surpluses, raise taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans' income taxes, cut taxes for middle-income families, as we did in the last session, keep property taxes down. The property taxes in Minnesota, the 10 years before I became governor, went up by 86%. Agriculture has had a special priority in the last spring.
Thank you. You're not going to give up rebuttal on this, are you?
No, afraid not. And again, here's the difference. I don't think this has to be as partisan an issue as you do, Governor, because I know of some Democrats in both the House and the Senate who agree that taxes are too high in this state and they are really impeding the creation of good jobs. And I think that I could actually work together with them to reform the tax code overall. Governor, you didn't just raise taxes on the wealthy. You raised taxes on everyone in Minnesota. There's a new healthcare tax. There's a much higher cigarette tax. You created this wheelage tax that counties have put on people. Farm equipment tax, snowbird tax, warehouse tax.
You.
You had to go back on some.
Thank you. Ms. Nicolette?
So, as I said before, revenue is not fixed, and what we know is that if we look at other models, there's an article from the Wall Street Journal called Millionaires Gone Missing, and Maryland decided to raise taxes just on millionaires. They thought, well, we'll raise a whole bunch more revenue if we do that. And what happened was that they had the means to leave the state, so they voted with their feet, and suddenly they actually collected less revenue in the end. So tax increases do not always mean more revenue, and tax decreases can often result, I could give other examples, but
Governor Dayton.
Commissioner Johnson, if you want to move from rhetoric to reality, the increase of 2% on the personal income taxes for people making over $250,000 a year in Minnesota will raise $1.2 billion in the next biennium. So tell us tomorrow, whenever, where you're going to cut $1.2 billion, real money from the state budget, education, human services, healthcare, because you want to repeal that tax increase on the rich. Tell us where you're going to make the cuts. Tell us how much local government aid will be cut, how much property taxes will go up as a result, because that's what happened before under that proposal.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Dana now. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions as short as you can from here on. Your answers as short as you can. Questions short too.
Good luck with this one then. From social media, what would you do about medical/recreational marijuana?
I'm sorry, Ms. Nicolette.
and we have how many seconds for this one?
30.
Okay. Okay, so full marijuana legalization, absolutely. It's a waste of resources. The societal cost is too much. We spend $456 million on our prison system in Minnesota, and to the extent that anybody is sitting in a cage for a nonviolent drug offense, that is a waste of a cage. Our last 3 presidents all admit to having smoked pot. If they are criminals, then they should be sharing a cage too, and that's an equal protection under the law issue.
Governor Dayton.
Well, I oppose legalization, because I think there are already enough drugs in there affecting the lives of our citizens, particularly our kids. And I signed the legislation for a controlled form of medical marijuana. There are companies now that are buying to produce the capsules that will have it on a limited basis, and we should see how that works. In an extent, it's going to help people who have serious medical problems, and all the more power to that project and proposal. But we're not going to turn our high schools and junior high schools over to marijuana peddlers.
Commissioner Johnson.
Well, I also oppose recreational legalization of marijuana. However, I think the medical marijuana issue is going to be revisited regardless of who's governor, and I would be willing to consider something more. I think where we ended up on this issue was more cover for the governor than anything else, because you said, no way I'm going to do it, and then you actually told the mother of a sick kid to go buy pot on the street, which I think is nuts. And then they came up with a compromise that apparently would work, but it didn't do much. So I'd be willing to go a bit further.
If you want to respond, you still have closings. You can respond to each other. We'll start this one. 30 seconds, Governor Dayton. Huge issue in lots of rural Minnesota. What would you do to, if anything, to increase broadband, high-speed internet?
Well, we very much need to increase broadband. We need to equalize the opportunity all over the state. It costs, we're told, between $800 million and $2 billion to do so, so it's a big project. We started last time, legislature, bipartisan support, provided $20 million to increase broadband into underserved, unserved areas of the state in greater Minnesota. That needs to be expanded once we can prove the effectiveness of it. We also need to figure out how we're going to get the private sector to come in and shoulder part of that additional cost.
Commissioner?
Well, I talk about this a lot because I say we need to be more competitive when it comes to business creation, and if there are areas of the state that just don't have access, we can't be competitive. So it's an important issue. I don't happen to believe that government should be in the business of competing with the private sector. So I don't think governments should be providing this service, but I do believe that there's a role for government to play to hopefully spur on the private sector to fill the gap that we have in certain parts of the state.
Broadband, Ms. Nicolette?
I believe that broadband is important for rural businesses so that they're able to compete, and I do see it basically like mail service where it's, it's our mode of communication, our primary mode of communication. However, we're on the cusp of new technology, so what I would like to see as far as the expense goes is that we focus on the areas that are not served at all, and run cable to all public buildings, make them hotspots, and make sure that there's a hotspot available in all rural communities.
Another question, 30-second answers. Unfortunately, a Moorhead resident wrote that my wife and I can sell our home in Moorhead and move to Fargo, and the income tax savings alone will cover our house payment. What I'm asking you folks to tell us in 30 seconds is what would you do, if anything, to help border cities like Moorhead or several others compete with what this gentleman says are lower taxes in neighboring states, not just North Dakota, but others. Commissioner, you have the first shot.
It's not difficult. We need to be competitive with the states that surround us. I think I've said that 10 times today, and we're not. We're simply not. Every state that surrounds us, I'm told, has billboards up that says, North Dakota, open for business. Iowa, Wisconsin, South Dakota, open for business. They are bringing our people, our entrepreneurs, and business expansion into their states because they are friendlier. They are more welcoming. We are just simply not welcoming enough, and we've got to lower overall our tax rate in the state.
Ms. Nicolette?
We need an attitude change from the state of Minnesota where we see ourselves as a customer service. We are facilitation and customer service, not a bureaucratic top-down hierarchy. So, we get our state competitive with other states around us, and we also make our state business friendly. And then people wouldn't want to leave. But as far as the income tax, specific taxes, people are always going to vote with their feet. And as long as we have different incentives, there will be people who do that. So there's not much we can do about border towns when we have a high income tax.
Governor?
North Dakota is a very special situation right now, and wish the good Lord had given us the oil resources that they're enjoying now in terms of their economic growth, and that's just the way it is. The state of Minnesota, except for North Dakota, has surpassed its neighboring states, all four of them, in growth in state GDP in the last 3 years, in growth in personal income. Our personal income is, per capita income is about $47,000 a year. Wisconsin is $41,000 a year. Iowa and South Dakota are lower than that.
I have a whole lot more questions. You have a whole lot more answers, but we can't go on. It's time for closing, and before long it'll be time for the public to vote on one of you or whoever else they want. We're going to have 2 minutes for closing statements, and by the luck of the draw, Governor Dayton, Democrat, starts.
I was born and raised in Minnesota. I lived most of my life here. The state's been very, very good to me and to my family. I started running for governor in 2009 because I saw the state headed in the wrong direction. Employing many of the policies that Commissioner Johnston now espouses, our economic growth relative to other states had worsened. Our per capita income had fallen. Our unemployment rate was 6.8%. I came in and we've taken a balanced approach, cutting spending with the Republican leadership in the Minnesota legislature in 2011, raising taxes on the richest 2% of Minnesotans, closing corporate tax loopholes, allowed large corporations to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And we invested that money in economic development incentives and mostly in education and in closing the deficit, repaying the school ship. So we balanced the state books. We're on a sound fiscal platform now. We have looking at a $627 million projected surplus for the next 2 years as opposed to deficits before. We repaid the $2.8 billion we owe the schools. We're in a sound financial position to keep moving ahead. And as I said earlier, we have 162,000 more people working in Minnesota today than when I took office. We'll continue that kind of leading economic growth. And that's my commitment, and that's what I'll continue to provide. The priority, again, needs to be education. We need to invest in education. We need to invest even earlier for kids who are from disadvantaged backgrounds so that they have a chance to be successful and realize the American dream. We're going to make sure the all-day kindergarten is applied. I congratulate Moorhead. This is one of the areas that before the state funding was already providing all-day kindergarten because the Moorhead school officials knew how important that was. Now it's going to be available everywhere in the state. Read by the end of third grade initiative, another one we started and are carrying out, is crucial to giving every child the preparation to be successful. That's my goal.
Hannah Nicolette, Independence Party candidate, 2 minutes.
Well, so I'd like to follow up on the marijuana issue because we do, if the drug war, waging a literal war, not treating drugs as a public health issue, but treating them as a criminal issue. We don't treat any other addicts like that. But if it's really about reducing drug abuse, Portugal decriminalized 12 years ago, and they were able to cut drug abuse in half. So that's a pretty staggering statistic. And now, as to my closing, my vision for Minnesota is that we would have a fabulous economy that would be the envy of the rest of the nation. And I believe that we can do that. We can do that with great team building. That's what I would like to do. I like to find talent and put people to task solving problems. I was a software developer. I like to solve problems, and that's what I would like to do for the state of Minnesota. Further, but I think we have a trust problem. Integrity is crucial in politicians. We have a trust problem in politics. We've come to the point where it's hard to even get angry anymore when we are promised something and there is no delivery on that promise. When we were told that we would have the most open and transparent administration ever, and instead we got more FOIA denials than any other administration ever. When we were told that the mission was accomplished, when we were told that we were going to end warrantless wiretapping, for instance, as a nation. And it's hard to even bring ourselves to be angry about those things anymore because we've grown so accustomed to it. So I was talking to a guy at the fair, and he said, I can tell that you're passionate and you're honest. And he said, but how do I know that once you get in, you won't change? And I'm going to tell you what I told him, which was that I have one dash. I think about my legacy every single day. I have my birth date and my death date and my dash. And my integrity is not for sale, and neither am I. And none of those interest groups put me on this podium today. I didn't raise that kind of money, and I would never sell out my state. Thank you.
Jeff Johnson, Republican.
Thanks, Don, and thank you all for being here, regardless of who you support. We all appreciate that. It's good to be home. We've lived in the cities now for a while, but northwestern Minnesota, for both Sandy and me, will always be home. And I think we would be served really well as a state by a governor who spent half his life in greater Minnesota and half his life in the metro. Somebody who understands greater Minnesota, who cares about greater Minnesota, whose family and roots are in greater Minnesota, because it really does seem, at least recently, like we got two states here. One is the metro, and one is everybody else, greater Minnesota. And I think if we have a governor who understands what it's like to be here, I think we could better bridge that divide, and I think we'd be a better state. And that really fits well with my vision for Minnesota. It's a vision of a state where every child, regardless of where you live, whether it's in the metro or in Minneapolis, the suburbs of greater Minnesota, has access to a great education and to great teachers, and where healthcare decisions are made by patients and doctors, not by patients, doctors, insurance companies, and government bureaucrats. And where entrepreneurs can run their business, and farmers can farm their land, and teachers can be creative and innovative in the classroom without worrying every minute about the government sticking its nose into their business. And it's a vision of a state where people who work in government understand that their job isn't to control and to regulate and to punish, but it's actually to serve the taxpayers who pay our salary. Government should be a servant of the people and not the other way around. And most importantly, I have a vision of a state where we have ended this bitterness and envy over income differences and this belief that the poor are poor and the rich are rich and all we can do is move around the money. And instead, we're celebrating people who are successful, and we are never giving up on people who are poor. And we are preaching every day a sincerely held belief that the poor can become the middle class and the middle class can become rich. That's my vision. That's why I'm running for governor. Thank you for being here, and I'd love your support.
I thank you three for being here. I want to also thank a special person who made this possible from Minnesota State University Moorhead, Elizabeth Everett Carnes, and her volunteers, student, staff set this stage up. So it's a beautiful presentation. We thank you.